Geothermal energy. It is looking like a very promising source of clean energy. How well does it work? Is it cost effective? Kirsten Marcia is our guest today. She's a geologist and CEO of Deep Corporation, acronym for Deep Earth Energy Production, a Saskatchewan-based geothermal energy company, and she joins me from Saskatoon. Kirsten, welcome to BCN.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you briefly share with a lot of our viewers who may not be familiar with what geothermal energy is?
Absolutely. So geothermal energy is natural heat from the center of the earth. So really, as long as the center of the earth remains hot, and let's hope it does, we have a constant, renewable, sustainable energy supply. What we're doing here in Saskatchewan is different than just heating a house. We're going to extremely hot, deeper zones within the earth where it's hot enough that we can actually generate power.
So how do you go about reaching this heat source really deep in the ground, and then how do you convert it into energy to heat homes?
So we drilled the deepest well ever drilled in Saskatchewan at 3,530 meters depth. At that depth, we can encounter 120 and 130 degrees Celsius fluids. We say it's water, but really it's a salty brine. And this brine is sourced all the way from the Rocky Mountains and goes all the way to South Dakota. They call it the basal Cambrian sandstone. It's a sandstone that sits on top of the really, really old crystalline basement rocks. And so what we do is we drill deep into this brine and have these very, very large producing wells where we mine the heat out of the water, take that heat, run it through a heat exchanger. That heat is then introduced to a working fluid, a refrigerant that can flash from the liquid phase to the vapor phase, and that's what drives the turbine. And then that cooled water gets injected back into the earth for reheating, some distance away from where we're producing from.
I think many of us have heard about residential homes using geothermal for heating, but the electricity part, maybe not so much. So how much different is the process to make electricity?
So this first project that we're doing is a smaller project. It's 5 megawatts, and every megawatt of power is roughly equivalent to 1,000 homes. So this first demonstration facility is 5,000 homes, but it really has the ability to both scale up at the first location. So just by drilling more wells, we can build a larger facility. But spaced along the southern part of our province in Saskatchewan, we'd like to build many of these facilities, growing to maybe 200, 300 megawatts of total consumption. We don't want to oversell this too soon or too early in the stage, but think of it as a large size wind farm, a 100 megawatt wind farm to begin with.
So let's chit-chat a bit about the pilot project funded in part by the federal government to develop that, as you mentioned, a 5 megawatt geothermal electricity generation facility near Estevan, Saskatchewan. Will this be a first for Canada?
It is the first for Canada, and it's shocking to me. I've spent my lifetime, developing our resources here in Saskatchewan. But believe it or not, the United States is the largest producer of geothermal power in the world. And yet we don't have a single megawatt of geothermal power here. So we're very excited about getting this industry kickstarted for Canada. We believe there's some great projects in Alberta, BC. Really the idea is to break barriers with this first project through this federal funding and really get this industry going.
So Kirsten, if the project ends up succeeding, is the plan then to go to maybe the next level and develop a full-scale 200 megawatt electricity generation plant?
That's right. I mean, we'll have to do this, based on the revenue of these projects. We'll use the revenue that we have in this first project and move that to fund subsequent facilities. One of the great attributes of geothermal is it has a really high cash flow. And what that means is that because we're baseload power, which means we're producing power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we're producing 3 times the revenue that wind or solar would have, which is an intermittent power source. So although geothermal can be a little bit more expensive to build, it pays back very, very quickly because of that very high cash flow.
Let's talk about some of your overhead. What kind of numbers are we talking about? Maybe share with our viewers how expensive that can be.
So the capital cost for geothermal is typically about $6 to $8 million per megawatt to build. But what's really important is the operating and maintenance costs are very low. So once they're up and running, they don't take many people. There's very little maintenance, and repair work going on. We akin them to, the lonely Maytag repairman. So, once they're going, that one lonely Maytag repairman can really oversee several facilities all at once.
Talk a bit about the clean energy portion of this here. How much of a carbon footprint is left behind, and what kind of pollution would a plant like this actually produce?
Zero. So these facilities, when they're up and running, there's no emissions that are given off. All of the fluids are closed loop, so the hot water comes up, it goes right back into the ground. The refrigerant we're using is also closed loop. So there is no emissions. There's no bird migration disturbance. There's no noise. And because they produce so much more power than wind and solar, they actually offset more greenhouse gas emissions than any of their other renewables.
Why do you think more companies haven't actually come forth and invested in geothermal compared to the wind farms that we see and the solar cells everywhere?
Well, that's a great question. One of the reasons we've had a long energy holiday of low prices. Our provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, we've been utilizing fossil fuels, coal generation for decades, and there's been a real shift in what the consumers want. And I think it's things like geothermal, which may be a bit expensive out of the start, have to be part of a rational mix of supply options. We want to introduce them, get them going, have the costs come down so that, over the next few years, it can have a much more significant seat at the table.
Are you receiving any pushback from environmentalist groups over concerns that drilling deep into the ground could potentially cause earthquakes or maybe some other environmental issues, perhaps harming wildlife?
We haven't had any pushback. One of the beauty of this project, it's right in the heart of the Bakken oil field. So the only time people get concerned about drilling rigs moving is if they're not moving in this part of the world. So there's a wonderful regulatory framework for all drilling activities to make sure that all wells are drilled very safely and that all potential environmental hazards are considered and taken care of.
Now, you said you had to dig pretty deep here, over 3,000 meters. How many holes to produce 200 megawatts?
Well, 200 megawatts is yet to be seen yet how many wells that's going to take. But let me talk about this first facility. We've modeled it to have 3 production wells and 2 injection wells. Now, we had some nice surprises in the first well that we drilled. The flow rates look much better than we expected, and it's hotter than we expected. So going back to the beginning of our conversation, we're heat mining. So high flowing wells with lots of heat means that we can mine more heat out of less wells.
How much land area would be required for the electricity plant?
The surface area is very small, actually. So, we're talking about a couple of acres. Most of what you're going to see in a facility is the piping towards the central facility, but they're very small. Think of a couple of Quonsets for each facility on the prairie horizon.
Now, what about terrain? Farmland is pretty good to drill through, but are there other areas of Canada where it might be a little more difficult to drill deep enough to get a good solid heat source?
Well, that's a great question because the challenge is getting deep enough in the earth where the drilling costs are still reasonable. I mean, when we drill in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, we're drilling through butter. It's very easy to drill. Versus if you go out to Ontario or Quebec, you have to drill through granitic rocks, but at those depths are not going to be very permeable. They're not going to have fluids in them. So, what we believe deep and some other projects in Alberta is that the lowest hanging fruit for easy project development is within within the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin.
Now, Kirsten, we talked a bit about upfront costs, millions of dollars to start up, but there's going to be a solid return on investment afterwards. But how would you compare the upfront costs with geothermal compared to coal-fired or natural gas energy plants?
Well, it's hard to compare with coal-fired because what we think of traditional coal-fired generation, we don't have that anymore. So the traditional coal-fired plants that we built here in Saskatchewan in the 60s, they're built very cheaply. And we have an infinite resource of lignite coal in Saskatchewan. The challenge is that we're not building and are continuing to use conventional coal. Our province invested $1.6 billion into a carbon capture project, world-class project, wonderful project here in the province, in order to capture the CO2 and inject it back into the ground. World-class project, but it didn't come with a very small price tag to make that happen. So comparing apples to apples, the United States believes that on an apples-to-apples basis, the fact that we don't have to buy a fuel, we don't have to run something when it's not running, it's the United States believes that geothermal is the cheapest form of all energy options, including nuclear.
Yeah, I'm told. I mean, the big benefit is more stability to the price of electricity simply because geothermal does not rely on fossil fuels, which fluctuate, right?
That's right. Yep, we don't have to buy a fuel.
At what point in the future do you expect to actually have this pilot project feeding electricity into the grid?
So we're on track right now to be fully commissioned with electrons on the grid by Q1 of 2022. We may do that a bit quicker. One of the long lead items is the surface facility itself, the turbine technology. And the manufacturers always give a much longer lead time until they're in a competitive bid. We believe that once we're in a competitive bid, 6 months from now, that those times will shorten up.
Kirsten, you must have some challenges, though, digging that deep into the Earth's core. I mean, 3,000 meters. What are some of the challenges that your company runs into?
Well, the drilling expertise that we have in Saskatchewan and Alberta is world class. I mean, we can be really proud of the labor force and the actual physical technology that we have here. So the drilling is not a challenge whatsoever. And the irony in this project is that we wouldn't even know that geothermal resource existed if it weren't for the oil and gas industry. They discovered it in their exploring for fossil fuels. The biggest challenge in this project, not dissimilar to a small junior company that's exploring for gold or base metals or diamonds, is the access to capital. Finding investors at the early stage to support projects, to see the vision, the future of building a more diverse energy future for the province is sometimes challenging. There's a lot of investors that will come up later and pay double for when there's no risk. But we've been very fortunate and very grateful in the past few months to have a huge amount of support from investors, both in Saskatchewan, but particularly within Calgary.
And I'm wondering, would the banks jump on board as well, knowing that you have a very low carbon footprint, right?
Well, we have a government contract. It's a 25-year contract with SaskPower. That's a AAA rated, locked in contract. And so, once we're in the construction phase, that's a very, very bankable contract for the lenders.
Kirsten Marcia, geologist and CEO of Deep Corporation. Thanks a lot for joining me today from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.